fog-drenched morning, Grace slowed her car when a lone bobcat appeared by the
Cô
roadside,
gái Grace Whitman đỗ xe và bước ra cẩn thận,
unmoving,
đặt tay lên cửa, đôi mắt
its
hiền lành
golden
đầy tò
eyes
mò và lo
fixed
lắng.
on the forest. For 3 days it hadn't left that spot. As she knelt, a faint cry rose from the brush behind it. In that fragile silence, she realized the cat wasn't lost. It was guarding something. Dawn slid gently over the 2-lane road, turning the fog a pale gold as Grace Whitman guided her dusty Subaru home. The world felt half-awake pine silhouettes, wet asphalt, the distant hush of a river until she saw it, a lone bobcat sitting by the shoulder, perfectly still, as if carved from smoke and light. At first she thought it was injured roadkill left upright by luck, but then its ears twitched. The bobcat sat squarely on its haunches, tail curled neatly, amber eyes fixed on something beyond the trees. No flinch at the sound of tires, no step back, just a calm, unnerving watchfulness that made her foot ease off the gas. Grace pulled over 20 yards ahead, hazard lights blinking softly in the pale morning. She watched through the windshield, hands resting on the wheel. The cat was big for a female, rangy but not starved, the speckled coat damp with dew. It didn't look lost. It looked anchored, like this strip of gravel had become its chosen border. She stepped out slowly, cold air brushing her face, camera bag thumping lightly against her hip. "Easy there," she murmured, voice barely more than breath. The bobcat turned its head toward her, pupils narrowing, reading her in one long, level look. Not wild panic, not trust either. Something older assessment, calculation, a question she couldn't yet hear. Most wildcats bolted at the first scent of human. This one stayed. Grace took a few careful steps closer, boots crunching the grit. The bobcat's shoulders tensed, but it didn't rise. Its gaze drifted past her, back toward the tree line, as if checking that whatever lay behind it was still there. Her pulse hitched. It wasn't guarding the road. It was guarding something else. A pickup rolled up behind her, tires hissing on the damp. Harold Briggs, her grey-bearded neighbour, leaned out the window with a squint. "You've seen her too?" he asked. Been parked right there 3 mornings straight. Doesn't chase cars. Doesn't leave. Gives me the creeps, if I'm honest. Then he drove on, leaving exhaust and a heavier silence behind. 3 days. The number settled in Grace's chest with a slow, sinking weight. No predator lingered this close to the pavement without a reason. She raised her camera almost out of habit, framing the bobcat against the blurred pines. That unblinking stare, the faint twitch of a torn ear. Through the lens it looked less like a threat, more like a question pressed into fur and bone. The bobcat blinked once, as if bothered by the click that never came. Grace lowered the camera instead. Up close now, she could see the stiffness in its right foreleg, the way its weight favored the other side. An old injury. Maybe. Nothing gory. Nothing dramatic. But enough to whisper risk. If it tried to hunt limping like that, it wouldn't last long. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly. The cat's whiskers flared. It shifted just enough to place itself more squarely between her and the brush that crawled down toward the ravine. Grace followed its line of sight. Brambles, rocks, fallen branches. Nothing moved. No sound but the breeze teasing dead grass. Her skin prickled anyway. For a fleeting second, their eyes locked again, and something in that golden stare scraped against an old ache inside her. It felt like the night she'd sat on a clinic floor with her aging house cat, listening to the soft final breath. That same heavy patience, that strange dignity in the presence of hurt. The memory rose unwelcome, tightening her throat. She stepped back, giving the bobcat space it had never asked for. A log truck roared in the distance. The cat's ears flicked, body tightening, but it still did not run. It simply sank a fraction lower, bracing, as if it had long ago decided this patch of gravel was a line it would not cross. No matter the noise, no matter the danger. Grace hesitated by her car door, torn between common sense and the tug of something unnamed. This wasn't just an unusual sighting to jot in a notebook. The air round the bobcat felt weighted, as if a story had already begun here without her and was waiting, stubbornly, for her to choose whether to step into it. She slid back into the driver's seat but didn't start the engine right away. In the rearview mirror, the Bobcat was a small, steady shape against the pale road, watching the trees instead of her. The sky brightened another shade. Somewhere, a crow called. Grace exhaled slowly, feeling the question settle in her bones. What could hold a wild heart in one place for 3 days? As she finally pulled away, the Bobcat did not follow, did not flee. It resumed its silent vigil, as if her presence had been measured and filed away. Grace drove the winding stretch home, with her hands loose on the wheel and her mind already circling back, knowing with a quiet, steady certainty that this was not the last morning she would see those unblinking eyes by the road. Morning came grey and low. The clouds pressed close to the hills as if listening. Grace drove back to the same stretch of road with a thermos of coffee cooling in the cup holder and a knot in her chest she didn't entirely name. Ahead, where gravel met weeds, the Bobcat was already there, as if it had never left at all. It sat in nearly the same spot, shoulders squared, tail looped neatly around its paws. The passing hours had left a faint roughness in its coat, but its posture held the same stubborn dignity. Trucks rolled by at a distance. The cat did not flinch. Its gaze pointed past the trees again, like a compass fixed on something unseen. Grace pulled off onto the shoulder, tires crunching softly. This time she didn't step out right away. She watched, letting the moment stretch. In the clean light of morning, she saw the stiffness more clearly, a slight drag in the right foreleg when it adjusted its weight. A careful economy of movement that whispered of pain buried deep. She reached for her phone and called Dr. Paul Hayes. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough from sleep but steady. When she mentioned a bobcat that had stayed 3 days by the road, he grew quiet in that particular way he did when something interested him more than he liked to admit. "Don't approach too close," he said. "I'll be there." By the time Paul's faded SUV rolled up, the sky had opened a little, washing the scene in a softer light. He joined her by the hood of her car, binoculars hanging from his neck, hands in the pockets of a worn flannel. Together they studied the cat. No froth at the mouth, no frantic pacing, no glassy eyes. Alert, aware, choosing to stay. That's not normal, Paul murmured. She's sore on that leg. Sure. But she could reach the tree line if she wanted. She's not trapped. His gaze shifted to Grace. Something's holding her there. The bobcat turned its head briefly at the sound of his voice, then dismissed him, eyes sliding back to the brush. Grace took a sealed pouch of meat from her bag, the same kind she used on long shoots. With a slow breath, she stepped a few paces closer, body low, palms open. The bobcat's ears flicked back. Muscles tightened along its shoulders. For a heartbeat, it seemed ready to vanish into shadow. Then it stayed, anchored, as if reconsidering. She placed the food halfway between them and stepped back, giving space. The scent carried on the damp air. Any half-starved predator would have moved. This one only stared at it, then at her, as if offended by the offer. After a long moment, it lifted its head and turned, angling its body to shield the narrow strip of brush that dipped toward the ravine beyond. Paul watched, brows drawing together. She's not interested in an easy meal, he said softly. That's a guarding posture. Grace followed the line of the cat's shoulders, tracing the invisible wall it drew across the ground. Weeds, some stones, fallen branches, nothing obvious. Still, the back of her neck prickled. A car whooshed past. Too close. Wind tugged at Grace's jacket. Dust lifting. The bobcat's fur rippled, but it did not bolt. It simply lowered itself, absorbing the rush of air, never turning its back on the thick tangle of green behind it. The choice was deliberate. Every instinct screamed wild, but every decision said stay. Standing there, Grace felt the familiar tug between sense and feeling. Reason told her to leave the animal to its world, to let time and instinct run their course. But the quiet steadiness in those amber eyes hooked into something old and unresolved in her, a grief that recognized guardianship when it saw it, even wrapped in claws. Paul lowered his binoculars. I've seen mothers sit like that, he murmured. Coyotes, foxes, they pick a line and dare the world to cross it. He didn't step forward, He knew better. If she's protecting something, she won't move until she knows it's safe, or until she can't stay anymore. The breeze shifted, carrying the faint, earthy smell of damp leaves and stone. For a moment, Grace imagined tiny movement in the brush, the possibility of a softer breath, a weaker heartbeat hidden just out of sight. She couldn't prove it, but the bobcat's absolute stillness was loud with purpose, and that spoke enough. As clouds thinned, light warmed the scene with a muted gold. The tension eased at the edges, but the question did not. Grace felt it settle deeper, no longer just curiosity, but responsibility. The bobcat had made this place a threshold. Whether she understood it or not, Grace had stepped onto the same line. When they finally left, it was not out of indifference, but out of a fragile respect. The bobcat remained, a silent figure at the edge of the road, gaze fixed on the hidden ravine. In the rearview mirror, as Paul drove away, Grace watched the wild cat grow small but never uncertain, still holding its post as if the whole forest depended on it. By the third morning, the fog came in softer, drifting low along the ditch like breath that hadn't decided whether to stay. Grace parked farther back this time, killed the engine, and simply watched. The bobcat was there before her, as if the sunrise reported to it. Same patch of gravel, same squared shoulders, same unwavering line drawn toward the brush. Up close, through the windshield, she saw how the night had weighed on its coat. The fur along its spine clumped faintly with dew and dust. The cat shifted its injured foreleg with measured care, hiding any weakness behind calm composure. Cars passed in distant bursts. The bobcat's ears twitched, but its body never surrendered that fragile, small territory. Grace stepped out slowly, no camera in hand, palms empty, offering only her quiet. The cool air held the damp smell of earth and cedar needles, a hush that made every sound feel too loud. She spoke low, more to the morning than to the animal. "You're still here," she said. The bobcat glanced at her, then back to the brush, as if confirming priorities. That stare toward the ravine had a weight she could no longer ignore. Grace followed its line with her eyes, tangled blackberry vines, fallen branches, a hollow where runoff had carved the slope. Nothing moved, yet the bobcat's muscles hummed with attention, subtle and constant, a living wire stretched between danger and duty. She took a cautious step toward the edge of the brush. The reaction was immediate. The bobcat surged half to its feet, a low warning rumble trembling through its chest. Not wild fury, but a firm boundary drawn. Its body angled, broadside blocking her view downslope. It wasn't just sitting here. It was standing what? Grace froze. Hands lifted in apology. "Okay," she murmured. "I see it." The cat's growl faded, but it did not relax. Its eyes stayed fixed on her a moment longer, then slid past her shoulder, listening to something she still couldn't hear. The road felt narrower, the air more precise, as if the world had narrowed to what waited in that ravine. Then she heard it, a thread of sound thinner than the breeze. At first it could have been a bird, a branch, her own imagination leaning into silence. But it came again, a weak, broken mule climbing up from the briars below. The bobcat's ears tipped back, but it didn't turn. It already knew. It had always known. Carefully, Grace knelt, keeping her body behind the invisible line the cat had claimed. She peered through the gaps in the green. In the shadow of a rotted log, pressed against cold earth, lay a small, mottled shape no bigger than her forearm. A bobcat kitten, ribs faintly visible, sides fluttering with shallow effort, eyes half-lidded, still trying. The warning came a deeper growl, close enough to vibrate in her bones. The mother stepped forward, placing herself fully between Grace and the kitten's hollow. No lunging, no swipe, just a clear message: you have seen enough. She drew herself up. Injured leg be damned, and became a wall of fur and will. All the softness coiled around the life behind her. For a suspended instant, their eyes locked. Grace did not see a monster holding up traffic. She saw a mother who had chosen the most exposed, dangerous place she could bear, because it was close enough to help if help came, and close enough to die if it didn't. The realization hit her sharp and clean. The bobcat wasn't lost. She was refusing to leave. Emotion rose hot and sudden, surprising in its fullness. Grace's mind flashed back to a clinic room and a fading heartbeat she hadn't been able to save. This time, the plea came in silence, wrapped in gold eyes and a rigid spine. She swallowed hard. "I'm not your enemy," she whispered. The bobcat held her gaze, then flicked an ear toward the ravine, as if time itself were running thin. The tension bled just enough for Grace to ease backward, palms still visible. The mother watched every inch of retreat, then turned her head to check the kitten with one quick glance. The tiny body shivered, tried to move, failed. The sound that rose from the brush was little more than air, but it was enough to explain 3 unbroken days beside the road. Standing by her car again, Grace felt the calm settle, fragile but present. The bobcat returned to her post, lowering herself to the gravel with slow deliberation. Everybody once more between the world and the hidden life below. The road reclaimed its distant hum. Overhead, a streak of sunlight slipped through thinning clouds and touched the cat's worn fur. Grace wrapped her arms around herself, the cool biting through her jacket. The wild had given her its answer and left the choice hanging heavy in her hands. She could drive away and let nature finish what it had started. Or she could step back into this quiet negotiation between fear and faith. As she watched the bobcat hold its lonely vigil, she knew the decision had already taken root. The 4th morning rose soft and colourless, a thin veil of cloud turning the hills the shade of cool ash. Grace parked in the same worn groove on the shoulder, less startled now and more pulled by a quiet urgency. The bobcat was already there, as if it had personally watched the night loosen its grip and waited for dawn to sign off on its promise. She saw the pattern of its vigil clearly now. Each slow shift of muscle kept the ravine within sight, never the open road. The injured foreleg touched down only when forced, a small wince buried under stubborn poise. The cat was leaner than on the first day, but the fire in its amber eyes had sharpened instead of dimmed. Grace called Dr. Poole before doubt could talk her out of it. By the time his old SUV rolled up, the sun was a pale disk behind thin cloud, smearing muted light over gravel and brush. He raised his binoculars, watched in silence then gave a short nod. "She's holding a line," he said quietly. "That's not random. That's intent." They did not cross the invisible boundary the bobcat had drawn. Grace pointed to the hollow in the brush, the fleeting glimpse of the frail kitten she'd seen. Paul's jaw clenched. "If that baby doesn't get help, it won't last long," he murmured. "If we rush her, she'll defend, and we'll lose any chance she lets us near." The bobcat's gaze followed every tilt of their heads, reading more from posture than sound. When Paul spoke, her ears angled, weighing tone. When Grace slowly knelt, lowering herself, the cat did not growl this time. Whiskers twitched. Her tail flicked once, less a threat than a warning that she was listening, not yielding. Grace set a shallow dish of water and a strip of meat closer than the day before, her hands steady only because they had to be. Every motion was deliberate, visible, an oath that there would be no tricks. The bobcat watched, muscles held like wire, hunger dragging against suspicion. Behind her, a faint stir from the ravine pulled at her focus. The minutes stretched thin. Cars hissed by and vanished. Finally, the bobcat moved, not toward the food, but sideways, leaving the barest corridor between her flank and the brush. It was not submission. It was a conditional offer. You may help, but you will not invade. Paul exhaled softly. Grace felt the weight of that small mercy. With infinite care, Grace inched forward to the edge of that narrow lane and eased the dish nearer the hollow, resisting the urge to look in, to reach. A tiny nose lifted, catching scent. The kitten's tongue, weak but stubborn, traced the rim. The mother tensed, every claw ready. Yet she did not stop it. She stood above them, holding her terror in place. For a suspended breath, everything balanced on that choice wild mother. Human hands, fragile heartbeat between. One wrong breath would detonate it. Instead, something unspoken passed through the cool air. The bobcat allowed this. She let her child drink water brought by a creature her bloodline taught her to fear. It was the smallest, loudest yes. Grace retreated the moment the kitten drank. not pushing the gift. The bobcat tracked each backward step, then checked the hollow. The tight band across her shoulders loosened by a hair's breadth. To a stranger, it was nothing. To Grace, it was a locked door shifting in its frame, admitting a sliver of shared ground. A break in the cloud spilled soft light across the scene, catching the bobcat's scarred ear, the curve of her ribs, the shadowed dip where the kitten lay. Paul let out a slow breath. "We'll give her time," he said. "Come back better prepared. If she wanted us gone, we wouldn't be standing here." The cat's ears flicked, as if she agreed on the terms. They left a low canvas lean-to near the brush, staked quietly, angled so rain would miss the hollow. The bobcat paced once around it, nose judging every unfamiliar fibre, then settled again between shelter and road, still the shield, but not entirely alone anymore. Trust hadn't bloomed, but its seed had been pressed into the damp earth. By late afternoon, the light thinned to a gentle grey. Grace and Paul withdrew to their trucks, with the slow caution you'd use backing away from a sacred place. The bobcat kept her post, head high, gaze locked toward the ravine. Behind her, the kitten's breath rasped a fraction stronger. The crisis had not passed, but for the first time, it felt shared. By late afternoon, the sky had sagged into a heavy slate. Clouds stacked low over the ridge, like something waiting to break. Grace parked facing the familiar curve of road, wipers ticking away the first scattered drops. The bobcat was there, steady as ever, framed against the dull light. Her body a small, stubborn ember at the edge of the storm. The air felt different, charged, restless. Wind threaded through the brush, bending the blackberry canes that hid the hollow below. The bobcat lifted her head, tasting the shift, ears pricked toward thunder that hadn't yet spoken. Her injured leg trembled once, a flicker quickly buried. Behind her, the unseen life in the ravine tugged at every breath. "Doctor." Paul pulled in behind her, his headlights briefly washing the cat in pale gold. When he stepped out, rain freckled his glasses. "They're calling for a real one tonight," he said. "If that little one's still down there, This ground will turn to a riverbed. His gaze found the bobcat. She won't leave on her own. Not now. The first true rumble rolled across the hills, low and distant. The bobcat's fur bristled along her spine, not from fear of the sky, but from what it meant for the hollow she guarded. She paced once along the invisible line, then returned, planting herself even closer to the drop, shoulders squared against an enemy she couldn't see but clearly understood. Grace and Paul settled into their vehicles as the light thinned, leaving engines off, watching through streaked glass. The rain came in earnest, slow at first, then harder, drumming on metal, turning gravel dark. In the downpour, the bobcat did not retreat to the trees. She lowered herself over the mouth of the ravine, body curved like a shield. Lightning stitched a brief white scar across the clouds. Thunder followed sharper now, rattling the side mirrors. The bobcat flinched but held, her tail flattening, ears pinned. Water began to snake through the brush, threads seeking the same hollow she'd chosen. She shifted, taking the full bite of the rain, leaving the sheltered crease for whatever lay beneath. From their cars, they caught flashes of her soaked fur clinging to bone, that injured foreleg buckling and straightening again. Grace's hand hovered near the door handle. Every instinct in her screamed to run down there, scoop up the tiny body she'd glimpsed before. Every lesson she'd learned said one wrong move, and this fragile truce would shatter. A stronger gust slammed sheets of water sideways, and with it came a thin, breaking sound rising from the ravine. It cut through the storm, high and desperate. The bobcat craned back, pressing her chest closer to the slope, as if her weight alone could block the flood. Her jaw parted on a sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a cry. That was the moment Grace moved. She stepped out into the rain, hands spread, letting the cold soak into her jacket. Paul was at her side an instant later. They didn't rush the bobcat. They walked the arc of the shoulder, staying visible, stopping just short of that boundary line. The wild cat swung her head toward them, eyes burning in the dim. For a heartbeat, the three of them hung in the roar of water and sky, two humans on the asphalt, one mother on the slope. a dying kitten below. The bobcat's sides rose and fell, each breath a battle. Then, slowly, impossibly, she shifted sideways. She did not run. She did not charge. She opened a narrow path down toward the hollow and held it. Paul's whisper barely rose above the storm. She's letting us. He moved first, crouched low, every step deliberate. Grace followed. The bobcat stayed close enough that they could feel the weight of her stare between their shoulders, ready to end this if they betrayed that sliver of faith. But she did not close it. They reached the hollow and saw the kitten clearly now mud-smeared, trembling, breath fluttering too fast. Water lapped at its tiny paws. Grace scooped it gently into a dry towel Paul had tucked under his coat. Her fingers careful, her heart pounding so hard she thought the bobcat must hear it. The kitten gave a thin, exhausted sound, then sagged. When Grace turned back up the slope, the bobcat stepped forward, rain streaming off her whiskers. For an instant, predator and human stood face to face. No barrier but air and thunder. The mother leaned in just enough to breathe over the bundle, confirming scent, confirming life. In her gaze sat terror, love, and something like a plea. Grace held that gaze and did the only thing she could. She nodded. No words. Just a promise set in the way she cradled the fragile body. Paul touched her elbow. They backed up the hill, never turning their backs fully, accepting the storm, accepting the trust. The bobcat followed a few paces, then stopped at the edge of the gravel as if bound. Headlights carved through the rain as they reached the vehicles. From the open door, Grace looked back one last time. The bobcat stood alone again by the road, soaked and shaking, but unbroken, watching the towel in Grace's arms, not the humans carrying it away. Only when the engine turned over did she lower her head, as if releasing something she'd held too long. As they pulled away toward the clinic's faint, distant glow, the storm rolled on over the hills. In the rearview mirror, the bobcat grew small beneath the churning sky, a dark shape anchored to that strip of earth. She had finally allowed her reason to leave, but she herself remained, keeping her post by the road, unwilling to go until she knew if the choice she'd made would save the life she'd stayed for. By the time they reached the small clinic on the edge of town, the storm had thinned to a tired drizzle, smearing the parking lot in wavering reflections. Grace hurried inside with the bundle pressed against her chest, while Paul held the door. The kitten's body felt feather-light, each breath a fragile tap against her palms, like a question barely asked. Under the warm exam lights, Ash seemed even smaller, a sodden scrap of fur and bone laid gently on a towel. Paul moved with practiced, calm stethoscope, careful fingers, a low hum of reassurance that was as much for Grace as for the little life on the table. Weak, he said, but fighting. Dehydrated, cold, yet stubborn in a way that mattered. They worked in an unspoken rhythm. Warm fluids, a heat pad cupping the kitten's belly. Tiny drops of formula brushed to a reluctant mouth. Each response was measured in the slow lift of ribs, the faintest press of a tongue, one paw flexing as if searching for purchase. Outside, rain tapped at the windows, more lullaby now than threat. In a quiet moment, Grace glanced toward the glass door as if expecting a tawny silhouette to appear and pace there. The Bobcat would still be out by the curve. She knew, holding her post as the storm unwound. One life lay under gentle light, one in the dark, both tied to the same fragile bargain neither species had language for. Paul watched her, reading what she didn't say. "We'll do what we can," he murmured, adjusting the line taped to Ash's tiny leg. "But he's here because she let him go when everything in her said don't." The weight of that choice settled heavily. A wild mother had wagered her heart on human hands and humming machines she'd never see. As the hours passed, Ash's breathing evened, no longer clawing at the air, no longer skimming the thin edge of silence. Grace sat near, elbows on her knees, fingers locked together, watching every rise and fall as if counting proof that trust hadn't been misplaced. With each fragile inhale, she heard the echo of the Bobcat's low, steady stare. Near midnight, the storm wandered off, leaving only dripping eaves and the occasional car hissing past on wet pavement. The clinic hummed softly, a mechanical heartbeat in the quiet halls. Grace stepped outside, drawing in cold, rinsed air, eyes tracing the dark curve of hills against a sky loosening into a thin, uneven band of stars. Her gaze turned instinctively toward the highway's direction, though distance hid the familiar bend. In her mind, the bobcat sat beneath that clearing sky, fur drying in the chill, eyes fixed on the spot where she'd last seen her kitten vanish into human arms. Not hunting, not sleeping, waiting for an answer only Grace and Paul now held. At first light, with coffee cooling untouched on the counter, Ash let out a thin, offended cry that sounded more impatient than afraid. He rooted clumsily toward the syringe, paws flexing with new insistence. Paul's shoulders eased. "That's better," he said. "He thinks we're too slow. A kitten that complains is a kitten that plans to stay." Relief came in careful increments, never all at once. Ash blinked against the brightness, nose toward warmth, curled deeper into the folded towel. A rough, broken purr starting up like an old engine catching. Each small victory made another truth sharper. The forest still belonged to him, and somewhere his mother still sat carved into gravel. Paul checked his charts, then looked up with the tempered hope of a man who'd seen both miracles and endings. If he keeps this up, we can move him soon, he said. Maybe tomorrow. But whatever happens, we owe her more than silence. He didn't need to name her. Amber eyes in the rain were already standing there between them. Outside, the day lay pale and rinsed clean, puddles holding slow clouds like borrowed sky. Grace paused with her hand on the clinic door, thinking of the bobcat's rigid shoulders, the way she had stepped aside in the storm just enough to let them pass. Ash was safer now, held by warmth instead of water, but a living promise still waited. She drove toward the familiar curve, tires humming a soft, steady line beneath her thoughts. Trees, mailboxes, sagging fences slipped past in their old order, while inside everything had rotated around a single wild heart. As the bend came into view, her chest tightened, bracing for the empty gravel that would mean she was already too late. Instead, she saw the tawny shape sitting exactly where Dawn had found her before. thinner now, fur roughened, but upright, unbroken, still turned toward the ravine. Grace eased onto the shoulder, killed the engine, and stepped out slowly. This time she didn't come with meat or excuses. She came with an answer the bobcat had earned. Morning drifted in pale and slow. Sunlight trying to dry the road, still damp from the night before. Grace stopped her car at the familiar bend, half afraid the space would be empty. But the bobcat was there, sitting in that same patient silence, no longer a creature of fear, but of waiting. The forest felt lighter somehow, as if it too had been holding its breath. She stepped out with careful calm, keeping her movements soft, the way one might speak to a dream not yet ready to vanish. The bobcat turned her head slightly, the faintest acknowledgement. The wound on her leg looked clean, though stiff. Her fur caught the light like burnished copper. She was still beautiful in that wild, unkept way, the kind that didn't ask for kindness, but didn't refuse it anymore. Grace placed a small carrier on the ground. Inside it, a folded towel and a shape that twitched beneath the fabric. Ash stirred, stretching his tiny limbs, blinking against the brightness. The sound of his small yawn broke the morning stillness, like a fragile bridge being built between two worlds. Grace's heart stuttered. "He made it," she whispered, almost to herself. The bobcat rose, cautious but composed. Every muscle seemed to remember pain and duty at once. She took one slow step, then another, tail low, eyes locked on the carrier. Her paws pressed into the gravel, silent, deliberate. Grace held her breath as the wild mother came close enough for the scent to carry across the air, the scent of her own, wrapped in human warmth. For a long heartbeat, the bobcat froze. Then she leaned forward, nose touching the towel, drawing in the truth that no human voice could explain. The faint chirr from inside the carrier pulled something loose in her chest. The growl that had once been defense softened into a sound nearer to ache. Grace felt it as clearly as thunder, though it came barely above a breath. She unlatched the carrier door and backed away, knees shaking, though the air around her was calm. The bobcat didn't lunge. She waited, testing trust one last time. Then, with the slow grace of something sacred, she reached in and lifted the small body against her chest with her neck and jaw. Ash gave a weak cry of recognition that sent a tremor through Grace's whole body. For a moment it looked like the storm again, raw. Impossible beauty carved out of fear. The bobcat turned toward the trees. Kitten tucked close, but then hesitated. Her eyes found Grace, and the world shrank to that silent exchange. Gratitude, maybe, or simply the recognition that some lines could be crossed without breaking. Either way, it held longer than sound ever could. The brush swallowed them slowly, the mother's spotted coat blending with the mottled gold and green of undergrowth. Grace followed only with her eyes, unwilling to break the rhythm. The forest moved around them, branches trembling, small birds bursting and settling again. Within seconds they were gone, and only the whisper of leaves remained. She stayed by the road long after the quiet had closed, staring into the place where fur had melted into shadow. The space felt different, now emptier. Yes, but in a way that healed. Paul's voice came back to her. If she lets you close, it means she's decided you belong to the story too. Grace finally understood what he meant. When she turned to leave, something metallic caught the sun near the ditch, a dull glint half hidden under damp leaves. She bent down and brushed away the dirt. It was an old dog collar, rusted, the tag worn but still legible, Scout. Her breath caught. That was the name Paul had mentioned, the dog who'd once shared this forest with a wild companion. Grace held the collar in her palm. Rainwater pooled in its curve like an unspent tear. So this was why the bobcat had lingered all those days, guarding not only her young, but the memory of a lost friend. She imagined the wild mother lying beside that collar through long nights, between storms and silence, unwilling to abandon what she loved. She placed the collar gently on a flat stone by the roadside, a quiet memorial for both lives intertwined by chance. The sun warmed her back as she stepped away. Somewhere deep among the trees, a faint cry rose and faded the sound of a kitten no longer alone. Grace smiled through tears she hadn't felt coming, whispering to the wind, "You can rest now. You both can." As she drove off, the forest slipped behind her in streaks of gold and green. The bend in the road curved like a memory closing on itself. In the mirror, the patch of gravel looked ordinary again, just another place along a quiet highway. Yet Grace knew that for one wild mother, it had been the center of the world. And for her, it always would be. Weeks later, autumn settled deeper into the hills, brushing the tree line in copper and smoke. The bend in the road looked ordinary, again just gravel, weeds, and the worn groove of tires. Grace still slowed there without meaning to, eyes tracing the spot where a wild mother had once held her ground against cars, storms, and doubt. One cool afternoon, with the sun sliding low and the air edged in wood smoke, she pulled over and stepped out. No bobcat waited by the shoulder. No gold eyes cut through the brush. Only the soft hiss of wind through dry grass and the steady murmur of the river below. It should have felt empty. Instead, it felt like a place that had done its job. She walked to the flat stone where she had left Scout's collar. The metal had darkened, the tag dulled, but it remained where she'd set it, cradled by moss and fallen leaves. Someone passing by might miss it entirely. For Grace, it was a page in a story only 3 souls had truly read a dog. A bobcat, and a woman who arrived late but stayed. As she stood there, a flicker of movement caught at the corner of her eye. High along the tree line, where sunlight broke in thin blades between trunks, a tawny shape stepped out. The bobcat. Her coat looked fuller now, leg surer beneath her. At her flank trotted a smaller form, all awkward paws and bright, curious stare-ash. Stronger, bolder, real. They didn't come close. Didn't need to. The mother paused long enough for Grace to see her clearly, framed in gold light. The kitten nudging at her side. There was no plea in her gaze this time. No storm-beaten desperation. Only recognition, cool and steady, like an old promise acknowledged and folded away. Ash pounced at a falling leaf, missed, tried again. The mother tolerated his clumsy enthusiasm with a patience Grace recognized all too well. For a moment, the scene blurred her mind, overlaying another shape beside the bobcat. a dog with a worn collar racing through these trees seasons ago. The forest held its ghosts gently, but it did not cling. The bobcat turned her head toward the road, toward the stone with the rusted tag, then back to Grace. It was a small movement, but it threaded every unanswered question together. She hadn't just refused to leave for her kitten. She had kept vigil for a memory, for a friend, for the last place two worlds had touched without fear. That realization settled over Grace like a quiet, unexpected warmth. She understood now why the wild cat had staked herself in the open, why she'd endured engines, rain, and hunger. This strip of gravel had been love's last marker first for a dog, then for a son. She would not move on until both were safely carried forward. The emotional catch rose sharp in Grace's chest, then eased into something softer. She lifted her hand, not a wave exactly, more a thank you traced into the air. The bobcat watched, unblinking, then gave the slightest tilt of her head before turning away. Ash followed, tail high, pausing once to look back as if memorizing the angle of light. They slipped into the trees without ceremony. No grand farewell, just fur dissolving into the colours of bark and fern. Grace didn't chase the moment with steps or sound. Wild things, she knew, were owed the dignity of their exits. All she could do was stand at the edge and witness what most people spent a lifetime never seeing. Cars whispered past now and then, drivers unaware of how close they'd come to a story greater than any headline. To them, it was just another bend. To Grace, it was proof that devotion wasn't a human invention, and that sometimes the bravest choice a wild heart could make was to wait in the most dangerous place until love was accounted for. As the sun slipped lower, she adjusted the collar on the stone, leaving it clean of leaves, not as a shrine to grief, but as a marker of completion. A bobcat had finally walked away on her own terms. A kitten had lived. A promise, once tethered to this road, now ran free beneath the canopy where it belonged. Driving home, Grace watched the forest flowing past her windows in bands of amber and shadow. She knew she would keep telling this story not as a rescue tale that made humans heroes, but as a quiet testimony to a mother who would not leave and a wild heart that remembered. somewhere behind her, paws moved soundlessly over earth, owing her nothing, and long after the engine's hum faded, the meaning of it stayed with her. She had seen a bobcat sitting by the road and thought it was lost. Only later did she understand. It hadn't been unable to leave. It had simply refused to. Not until love in all its forms was safe enough to let go. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.